Alright, this is how the new DJI Action 5 Pro performs in a studio environment using a relatively simple lighting kit, a professional USB-C microphone that's connected directly to the camera, costume camera settings, and a couple of color grading tricks that I'm going to show you in this video. In terms of mounting, I have the camera mounted to a super clamp, which I attached to my cheap camera desk mount. However, you can use pretty much anything because this camera is so lightweight. You can try using a tripod, a light stand, or even a selfie stick with legs at the bottom. As long as it's going to hold the camera, it should work just fine. Next, in terms of audio, I'm using the Rode PodMic USB microphone. It's mounted to my desk using a 15 desk boom arm, which allows me to move the microphone around and position it as close as possible to me to get the best sound quality. And it's connected directly to the camera with a USB-C cable with the audio gain set to +5 in the camera settings. In terms of lighting, I have three main lights in this shot: a key light, a background light, and also a rim light, along with some practical lights behind me to make the background a bit more interesting. For the key light, which is on my left, I'm using the iFootage SL60DN with a Godox 70 by 100 cm softbox to make the light source bigger and softer. This light is set to 100% brightness to reduce the ISO as much as possible on the Action 5 Pro to get the least amount of noise in the image, and it's positioned at about 30 degrees to the side of the camera, slightly above me, pointing downwards to get the most pleasing light possible. The second light I'm using in this shot is this SmallRig RT25 tube light behind me, which acts as a practical light but also a rim light, illuminating this part of my face and separating me more from the background. It's only set to 30% brightness, but I have its barn doors slightly closed to reduce the light spill as much as possible. And finally, I have the Zhiyun X60 on top of this cabinet, set to 5600 Kelvin, 15% of brightness, and it's basically illuminating the background behind me because otherwise it will get too dark. And also I have this practical light on this side, this tube light, orange tube light, and this light as well, along with my laptop, which also acts as a practical light. Moving on to settings, I set the resolution and frame rate to 4K 25p to achieve the highest image quality. Next, I set the field of view to standard to avoid the fisheye look as much as possible. Then I turned off Rocksteady because the camera sits on a tripod. And in the image adjustment menu, I used costume settings with texture and noise reduction set to -2 to make the footage look as natural as possible. I set the color to D-Log M to get the most flexibility when editing my footage in post-production. Then I set the white balance to 5600 Kelvin because my key light has the same color temperature. And finally, I set the shutter speed to 1/50 to get the most exposure without affecting motion blur, and the ISO to 100 to minimize the noise in the shot as much as possible. Alright, finally, let me show you how I color graded this clip inside DaVinci Resolve. So first of all, this is how the shot looks like straight from the camera without any color grading. Pretty boring and bland. And this is with color grading. As you can see, it makes a significant difference. So let me show you exactly what each one of these nodes do to make the shot look just the way you see in here. So first of all, I have here a CST in and then a CST out. I'm going from Rec. 709 to DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate because I prefer to work in a wider color space. However, if you are a beginner, I would suggest to completely skip this step. Next, I have here this contrast node where I basically use the curves with editable splines and reduced the exposure on the darkest parts of the frame in the shadows and slightly increase the exposure in the highlights to create an S-curve and basically introduce more contrast to the shot. This is the before and after, before and after. Next is the balance node where I basically adjusted the white balance with the offset wheel in here. The shot looked like this out of the camera, a bit red and yellow, and I basically reduced the red, increased the blue to compensate for the yellow. This is the before and after, before and after. Next is the saturation node where I basically added some saturation to the shot. I use the color slice page for that because it only adds saturation without affecting the exposure and contrast. As you can see, if I go up and down, it only affects the colors, not the exposure or the contrast. Now let me put it back to 1.3. And this is the before and after, before and after. Right, next I have here this shadows node where I basically cleaned up the shadows with the luma versus saturation curve, and I pushed down the saturation on the darkest parts of the frame to make the shadows look as clean as possible. I basically do this on all of my clips with all of my cameras. All right, next I have here this skin compound node. Inside I have a DCTL just to make sure I'm doing everything correctly. This is a free one. If you want me to share a link to this DCTL, let me know down below. And in this node in here, I basically did all the adjustments, and I used the color slice page for that with the skin wheel and also the red wheel. I basically adjusted the hue in here using the DCTL just to make sure I adjusted the skin tones as good as I can, and I did the same thing with the hue in the red just to make my skin look as good as possible. And I also desaturated the skin color to 0.96 and added some density to my skin color, and I did the same thing with the red colors. As you can see, you can add saturation or reduce it. I basically reduced the red saturation in here and added some density with this slider in here, and this is the before and after, before and after. All right, next are the window adjustments. This is the before and after, before and after. On the first window, I used the pen tool, created a mask in here around the left side of the frame, increased the outside and softness to make the transition a lot smoother, and I used the color wheels with gamma just to reduce the exposure on this part of the frame. And this is the before and after, before and after. And on the second window, I basically added a circular mask around me, inverted it, and then in the color wheels, I again reduced the gamma just to create a vignette around me. This is the before and after, before and after. As you can see, it adds some vignette around me and again separates me more from the background. Now in this node, I basically added some color separation between me and the wall. This is the before and after, before and after. I used the qualifier for that. Let me press Shift H to see what I qualified. Invert it. I basically qualified my skin, and then I flipped it around because I wanted to only affect everything outside my skin. And I used the color wheels to introduce some blue, teal, and also reduce the green in here to balance out everything. And in the HDR wheels, I slightly reduced the exposure to make everything a bit dark. And inside this key node, I reduced it again to 0.3 because if I set it to 1, it's a bit too strong. And again, this is the before and after. It basically creates a separation between my skin tones and the wall, further separating me from the background. All right, next is this defocus node. I basically used again a circular window, and then I added this defocus background effect. I increased the blur to 0.4, and then in here I set the anamorphism to 0.96 to add some blur around the edges of the frame to make it look like the shot has depth of field, even though it doesn't. So this is the before and after, before and after. As you can see, it makes everything blurry on the edges of the frame, but it keeps me sharp. It doesn't affect me because I have a mask basically around me. It only affects the edges of the frame, which makes it look a bit cooler and further separates me from the background. All right, next is this lift node where I basically lifted up the shadows and compressed the highlights to create somewhat of a filmic look, and I used the curves for that, but only with the luminance adjustment in here because I didn't want to affect the saturation in the shot. And I basically increased the shadows, lifted up the shadows to make them look a bit brighter, slightly increased the contrast back with the editable spline in here, and I did the same thing with the highlights, but I pushed it down because I wanted to compress the highlights to make them look softer. But again, I introduced back some contrast with the editable splines by pushing the highlights up in here. Before and after. Let me go back in here. Before and after, before and after, before and after. As you can see more information in the darkest parts of the frame, whereas before everything was a bit more contrasty. All right, finally I have here this dehancer node where I used only one tool, and that's the film compression, to basically compress the brightest parts of the frame and make my skin look a bit smoother, make the transition between the shadows, midtones and highlights a bit smoother. So this is the before and after, before and after. Look here, again, before and after, before and after. As you can see, it compresses the highlights and makes my skin tones a bit smoother, if you will. All right, I guess this is it for today. Thank you for watching, and if you have any questions or comments, let me know down below, and I guess I'll see you again soon with new content about the Action 5 Pro. Peace.